Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, our topic will be forks. However, not just regular forks, when a situation is already set up, ready to give the fork, but there is something little extra you need to do before the situation matures for action, when you can actually make the forking move and win material. Let's get started with our first example in this lesson. This is a rook and knight endgame with even material at the moment. The first thing is to understand where is the forking motive, the forking pattern. Hopefully, without spending too much time, you can figure out what we're trying to do. Now, after you realize what we're trying to do, the next step is to understand why it does not work right away. And then we can get to the final and third step, in that what can we do to get rid of that one little problem that's left that stops us from forking immediately. Okay, the answer to the first question is the black king and black rook are situated in a way that if there wasn't something stopping it, the white knight could move to f6, attacking both those highlighted black pieces, check the black king, and if the king moves out of the check, then white would be ready to capture black's rook. The problem is that the black knight at the moment is guarding that spot, and if indeed white would play knight f6 right away, the black knight would capture it and say thank you. Well, let's go back, because white can do better. So thinking logically, we know what we want, we know what stops it, so what we need to do is chase away that defender. And the move is playing c4. What happens here is the pawn attacks the knight, and of course, as we know, the pawn is a clearly lower value piece than a knight. So if the knight decides I'm not going anywhere, that will mean that white will win the knight either for nothing or for only giving up one little pawn. On the other hand, if the knight tries to save himself, that will cost even more, because white now indeed will jump to f6, check the black king, and when the black king moves out of the check, then white wins in fact a full rook. Now, from black's perspective, you're much better off losing a knight or losing a knight for a pawn rather than losing a full rook. But in either case, white is gaining significant material. Let's move on and see a slightly different scenario. Again, the first step is to understand the pattern. What is white trying to do? And we can see what white is trying to do here is to use the unfortunate positioning of black's king and queen. Why is it unfortunate? Because there is a forking pattern right in the air. Now, step number 2, understanding why it's not a good idea to make that knight check right off the bat. Not too hard. If the knight indeed right now would move to c6, the black bishop would capture it. So therefore, it's important to remove the defender. In this case, attacking the bishop with the pawn right away, like we did similarly in the first example, wouldn't work so well for various reasons. For one, the bishop could simply move away and still maintain the protection of the key c6 square. Moreover, black could do even better, because now black would have a forking opportunity to check and attack the white knight. So f3 would be, in other words, out of question. It wouldn't accomplish what we're trying to. On the other hand, there is a different element, and in this case it means a temporary sacrifice. White can sacrifice his most valuable piece, the queen. Look at that. White gives up a queen for just the bishop. Now again, if black does not capture the white queen, then it's end of story. White just won a bishop. At the same time, if the pawn captures the queen, then we accomplished our goal, and at the end of the deal, we can see that while both queens are gone, black's bishop is gone, the white knight is still on the board, so we can see that white gained material while trading the queens, and white is up an extra knight, and that pretty much guarantees an easy win, playing technically well the endgame. Let's move on. And here we are at the next example. Again, what I suggest you to do is first, focusing in this lesson, look out where is a potential fork. Now, in some cases, there may be more than one such pattern. However, you have to be careful and look out how many times is the opponent protecting a certain square. If it's protected by 2 or more pieces, it's pretty much impossible to get away more than one defender in one move. So it's likely that it's not the right direction to go to. For example, in this case, you may think that it is the black king and rook, and the white knight could maybe go to a6 to fork them. However, you can see that black has a pawn guarding that square as well as a rook guarding that square. So therefore, that a6 square is well protected. So it's really important to look out for a different pattern. Just because you see that even though a pattern is there, there's nothing you can do about it, maybe you can look for a second opportunity. And in this case, the important ones are the fact that the king and the bishop are positioned the way they are, and white has a knight e6 check fork in the books. It's true that white could make that move in this position right away too, and when rook captures, then capture black's rook on b4. And white would gain material because they gave up a knight but captured the opponent's rook. However, white can do even better in this case. And this is one of those examples when we're pulling a hand of a defending piece. The black rook right now on b6 has a dual duty. On one hand, guarding the fork on the e6 square, and on the other hand is protecting his other rook on b4. The problem is that if white simply trades rooks on b4 first, then the rook had to prioritize and give up control of the e6 square, recapture on b4, making sure black doesn't stay behind the whole rook, but that meant that now the fork is ready and black is losing a bishop for free after the black king moves out of the check. Let's keep going to see more examples. Here we are. Now this situation is yet a bit different. To start with, it is black's turn, not white, and also it is different in that black needs to still kind of do something to accomplish the fork. The immediate idea of coming down to d1 would be a simple blunder because the king is not forced to move out of the check, but white would just capture the rook for free, and that would be quite a suicidal move. On the other hand, black has the opportunity to remove the guard of the d1 square, and more importantly, by doing so, forcing a new white piece to the corner a1 square. While, quite important difference, that new piece that now is in the corner on a1 does not protect the d1 square. So therefore, black would simply come down with the rook, check. Now already white has no choice but move the king out, and here comes the free bishop in the corner. Let's move on. Here we go. Now, in this position, you will need to use a little bit of imagination. First of all, I'd like you to establish where is the pattern that will cost black material. Remember, we're still thinking and talking about forks. And the answer to that first question is that the black king and queen are positioned on the same file. So what that means is that if the white rook could jump over the bishop and move to h4, that would be quite deadly for black. Why? Very important. Because white has a pawn on g3 that is protecting also that same h4 square. Okay, so far things are clear. The problem is white still has a bishop on c4, and obviously by the rules of the game you cannot jump over your own piece. What can you do? If you simply move your bishop out of the way, for example to b3, setting up this trap of next playing rook h4, that would give black the time to move either the king or the queen out of the h file, and once they won't both be on the same file, black is off the hook. Therefore, it's quite important to make an energetic move. Remember, energetic moves are either checks, captures, or the attack of an enemy piece. So in this case, the most natural, simplest, and best move is for white to capture black's bishop. Remember, if black does not capture now white's bishop, then white won a piece. And of course, that's still the least of the damage that black can get away with. On the other hand, if the pawn does capture the bishop, then already we opened up the fourth rank. The bishop is no longer blocking the rook from swinging over to the other side, and therefore now comes rook h4. Check, very important. If the king moves, white just captures the queen. Therefore, the relative best response for black is to give up the queen for the rook, but then pawn captures queen, leaving white still with a full extra rook on the queen side. Let's continue and move on. Here we are. Now here again in this position we need to use imagination. First, we need to establish what are we shooting for, what is our goal, where is that potential fork. Well, that potential fork has the ingredients of black's king and rook. Now imagine if the white queen could capture his own pawn, that would mean that the black king would end up being in a check and the black rook would be attacked at the same time. But by the rules of the game, you're not allowed to capture your own pieces. So the question is, what can you do to move that piece out of the way, clearing the d4 square for your queen? Well, in this case, fortunately for white, white can do so in a very effective way by playing d5, attacking black's bishop. The bishop is attacked, and now black has to choose either giving the bishop up or allowing the fork, which is not a pleasant choice. Again, the lesser loss is to give up the lower value piece, which is the bishop. But that, of course, is also a major loss. And on the other hand, if bishop moves away, then comes the fork. Check. And when the black king moves out of the check, simply queen captures rook, and black's position is rather hopeless, having only a bishop for white's queen. Let's move on, and here is the next example. This is another rather tricky one because the fork is not quite readily set up. The white queen can attack both black rooks in various ways, but unfortunately any of those tries would end up losing your own queen. So what white is really trying to do in this situation is to fork black's king and the black rook, or one of the black rooks. Naturally, I'm not referring to checking with the queen on e8, which again would be captured by black's rook. That would be a horrible idea. But in order to check black's king safely, the g6 pawn would need to be out of the way. Fortunately, given the circumstances, white can achieve that quite quickly and easily. Can you think what may be that idea? Well, it's again involving a trade. White can trade the bishops. And here again, black has a choice to recapture or not, but if they do, they'll suffer badly because here comes the fork, attacking the black king as well as the black rook. At the same time, we know the drill already. The king needs to get out of the check, and then the white queen can do its magic and capture black's rook on d8. Of course, just as in some previous examples, black is better off avoiding losing the rook and rather live with losing the bishop that white just captured. In either case, white has won significant material. And let's move on. Here we are. Now this is another tricky example because the forking pattern has not been created yet at all. So white needs to force black into a fork first. In this endgame, materially speaking, black is up a pawn. The black queen is protected by the bishop, so therefore it seems that things are under control. Yet they are not. When you have a knight and the opponent has a king and queen, it's oftentimes a very dangerous setup, and oftentimes it is possible to force the enemy king onto a fork. While it's true that the black king and queen, even right now, are in a potential forking situation to a white knight, for example, if the knight could go to g6 or e6. But that is quite impossible. In fact, if you try to look, you will realize that to get to either of those two squares for the white knight, it would take at least 3 moves. And that, of course, is too slow. White cannot accomplish that. However, white is able to force the black king to a different forking pattern. And imagine if the black king right now would be on e7 and not on f8. Well, then already the white knight could go to d5 and attack the king and the queen. But how do we force our opponent to that square? Let's try a check here on c8. Well, it invites the black king to e7, but also leaves the option open to go to f7. And then we're not talking about any kind of fork, and it is black who is better. So therefore it is absolutely essential to give the check from the other side, from g8. Why? Because this limits black's options to a single option, and that is to move to e7 with the king, and then comes knight d5, fork, and even though the bishop is protecting the queen, white has gained significant material advantage, and it's not hard to believe that a queen will win even though black still has a bishop left on the board. Let's move on. Here we go. Well, here again it's a situation that if you look carefully you realize the forking potential. So that's step number 1. And here we're involving a new piece that yet none of the previous 8 examples included. Can you figure which white piece that is? And that is the white bishop. With that hint, hopefully you can figure out the answer into what are the 2 black pieces that will be involved in the fork. And yes, those are the 2 black rooks. So now we already know the 3 participants in the fork. The only thing left to figure out is where is the key square where the white bishop is forking. Well, that square is on d6. And then you'll see that the bishop will be going in both directions towards the 2 black rooks. But there is still a problem. The problem is the white knight standing on the way. So therefore, what white needs to do here is, as usual, do a forceful move. Remember, forceful moves are either checks, captures, or attack of another strong piece. And in this case, it's a capture. It's a trade. And then when the black pawn recaptures, voila, here we are. The fork is ready. 2 of the black rooks are attacked, and one of them will be lost. Of course, given the fact that black's rook on f8 is still protected by his king, it is clearly safer to move the other rook, which is not protected at all. And now, finally, let's see the last example on the theme of forks for this lesson. Here we are. In this endgame, white is up a pawn, but that may not be enough to win in itself. However, white can create a fork. At first, when you still have a knight on the board, you'd look, how can I fork with my knight? The knights are famous for how powerful they are when it comes to forking. Well, if you'll do the search, you realize that the knight doesn't have any good forks coming up. The only squares the knight could fork at, the 2 black rooks, would be on e7 or e3, but none of those squares are available for the white knight, and in fact it would take a number of moves to get to either of those highlighted squares. So reality is that we want to involve a different piece in the forking. And that different piece is no other than this little pawn on e2. Now we got it. If that pawn could go to e4, where our knight is at the moment, that would be forking the 2 black rooks. As we already know, we are not allowed to capture our own knight, but in this case, white has an excellent opportunity to make a forceful move and with that clear the e4 square. Well, I think you got this already. Again, we're dealing with a trade, and then when black recaptures, here we go, here is the fork, and black will lose one of their 2 rooks. Of course, not recapturing would be the better option here for black, because it always is better to lose just a knight rather than a full rook. So therefore, black, for example, could move the rook away, but then the white knight will be free to go, and white would be happy with the material gain achieved. What we saw in all of these 10 examples is that there was a forking pattern, and we had to do something to make it work. The pattern was there right away, but it didn't work right away for one reason or another. I hope that this lesson gave you some more insight on little tricks on how you can gain material with the help of one of the most popular and common patterns in chess, the fork. In other words, when you attack 2 enemy pieces simultaneously. Thank you for listening, and be back next week for some more chess knowledge. Bye-bye.